Hello, and welcome to episode 11 of the Odds and Ends podcast. I'm here with my good friend Josh Wilkes. Josh is a recent master's graduate of the, I'm going to get this wrong, Sun Yat-Sen University in Taiwan. That was, Josh is giving me a face like I'm going to let Josh do that in a second. Josh, what's the university?
National Sun Yat-Sen University. So you got everything
Okay.
right except the easy word.
Yeah, okay. I can remember one word at a time. And also, Josh is an expert on China, and he has good China takes and Taiwan takes. So that's why I want to talk to him today. Josh, how you feeling?
Feeling good. Feel obliged to say that I probably wouldn't describe myself as a China expert, but I'm happy
Well,
for you to say
you
it.
know, what is what is expertise anyway? It's just
Yeah.
people I trust and update towards. Um, I, and we'll get to it, but I just think we don't know anything about China. I think we don't talk about it nearly enough or something. So we'll get to that. Josh, what's your relationship with forecasting?
Uh, wow, that's a great question. Uh, my relationship with forecasting is initially and largely through you, in that we went to university together and became very good friends, like from the get go at university, and then you came
Let's
to
not go too far.
forecasting. You came to forecasting 3 years ago, maybe 4 years ago,
Hmm.
and I sort of kept it as arm's bay as long as possible. But then you managed to sort of catch me with the fantasy football thing last year, and then I've been a active manifold.
Josh is surprisingly, given his accent, when Josh says fancy football, he does mean fancy American football,
I do, yeah,
which you're a bit of a fiend on.
yeah.
Um,
Although I have been, as they say, batting at around 500 for quite a long time now, which is
I don't even know what that means.
it's a baseball
I don't.
reference.
I know you're making a joke as well. I don't even get the joke. Is that the wrong number? Is that?
No, I'm just
Um,
it's funny. Well, it's not really funny at all. But if it were funny, it would be funny because it's a baseball reference, not an American football reference.
um,
I
right.
think I don't know anything about about baseball.
You and me both. So I guess the thing I'm interested in here is like, what do you think are some things that are worth talking about China? Like to even start, I don't I don't think we know enough about China. I don't think we forecast enough about China. But I don't even think the forecasts I read. Someone I was in a bar the other week, and someone was asking me about. They were saying, oh, like, what's going to happen about China? Why do you? And I realized that I read forecasts in China, but I don't even. I sort of don't even know what the there is to start. Right, with US, we could do some. We could talk about who's going to be the president. We could talk about some policy stuff. We could talk about like what is really important about US policy. I mean, I think the president implies some things. I guess what do I think the really important stuff about it? I mean, maybe this just highlights the problem doubly. I guess like you could have some stuff about economic growth, maybe some stuff about maybe I think AI policy is very important. But yeah, I sort of don't even know where to start on China. So like, what do you think are some key things worth thinking about?
I think I think a good place to start is to sort of try and sketch out what the relationship between thinking about China and forecasting could be, because, like you said, it's very hard to know things about China when you are outside or inside of China. And what I mean by that is that somebody who lived in China for 4 years and then subsequently sort of somewhat studied it in my master's, um, I continually find myself, if I try and give a definitive take, like this will happen or this will not happen, it's almost impossible to kind of make several of these without that you really believe definitely will or will not happen, without being very quickly proven wrong. Um, and I think a lot of people who comment on China are mostly people who are far too comfortable with like continually being wrong about stuff. And the other side of the coin is that people who do know their stuff, who are really good, they're still very aware of this limitation, and so they sort of don't say things at all. So they often end up giving not very useful information because they're just correctly unwilling to say something will or won't happen. And so I think that the use of percentages to try and sort of color in likelihoods is particularly useful for talking about China, because then you kind of give yourself a space to say, well, yeah, I thought it was going to happen, but I said 70%. So we're now in the 30%, rather than, and everyone can't go, you're wrong, you're wrong. And they can be like, oh, how wrong were you? We can have an actual conversation, and you can try and, like
So
build.
yeah, I mean, I think yeah, in total agreement. Are there any questions which spring to mind as things which that allows you to talk about that you might be rested to talk about otherwise?
Yeah, I think and I think this was sort of forecast quite a lot, would be like trying to think about when was zero COVID going to end, right? Or like the big question that we may or may not get to, like if there would ever be an attack on Taiwan, right? Like these are questions to which like yes or no answers are just not very helpful. I don't really think that it's a question like, you know, will Xi Jinping be in power next year? I think this is much harder to kind of put numbers onto. But we can try. We probably will try, right?
Yeah, I mean, do you think that she is like? Do you think that's a key question? I mean, I think that is like the easy question to think about because he's a leader like other leaders. You can think he'll be a leader that will stop at some point.
Yeah, it's a huge question, right? Uh, a lot of, I believe, a lot of China analysis has now just baked in the idea that Xi Jinping will be the president indefinitely. And in fact, often from the way people talk, it almost seems like they forgot that he's just an old man. They sort of seem to think that he might be president when he's 110. He
Okay,
won't be, right?
so
That
I
seems
mean,
very
do you
unlikely.
want to give? Yeah, do you want to give? I mean, when is there a natural like breaking point? Like
Yeah, there
I
are.
might naturally go towards like 2030, but I think there's like sort of 10-year terms or something. So like, is 2032 or something the next point where
Yeah,
it's
there are
natural
there are
sort of thing?
5-year terms. So 2027 is the next natural breaking point, and then 32 after that. Um,
Okay, so it's sort of like 2028 and 2023 then to sort of give us some like time after that.
oh, you mean will he be president? Yeah, yeah, sure. Um,
So I mean, like, do you have some sense of what numbers you think there?
I think the community is. Well, I guess there are different communities, right? I don't think there are many people who think that he will step down in 28, that he won't run, and there are anybody who told you they were confident that he would want to continue and be unable to would be in a sort of like really taking a very minority position. So immediately we can. So I think it's ignoring health issues for now. We can push the number for 28 like way up, like into 75. I think just as a kind of a ballpark, just to be like, yeah, that seems very likely. We should Google his age because I don't know it off the top of my head, and that's going to be very, very relevant by the time we get to
Okay,
32.
I'm going to guess he's between 60 and 70.
I
I guess
think
he's
he
between
is
57 and
72.
70.
I think he's 72. I think he's older
He
than
is
that.
70.
He is 70 now.
Yeah,
So he would be 79 in 33. He would be 80 in 33, right?
right.
So, that's kind of like a
Okay, so
useful.
so you're okay. You're already like quite. So you're like you're 0.75. So you're like above Metaculus. Okay, fine. So I mean, why do we think?
Well, I would want to tweak it with like some stuff about how likely he is to just not make it physically, or he'll be to die in office. So it does go down a bit. What's Metaculus got on it?
50-50
I think
in
that's way too low.
2030?
Okay, yeah, that's kind
Well,
of.
it's like 2 years though.
Yeah, but it's really important. Like whether he gets another term is a much bigger question than whether he dies between 29 and 30, right?
Yeah, I know, but
Yeah.
like I almost think that 2028. Okay, surely he's going to get another term. What's the case for him not getting another term?
Um. So there would be several. There are. Let's divide the cases into three off the top of my head. Number one, he decides that he's comfortable to step down and that he thinks that that's a reasonable thing to do. I think that people assume that the politics at the top of the Communist Party is. I think people just have too much in their head that this is like a completely bloody game and that there's no way for him to sort of to get to resign. And I just don't think that's true at all. Like, the previous presidents have all stepped down. So to suggest that he couldn't step down just is quite is quite bold. Now there are differences because he's given himself a hitherto unexpected third term. So he might decide to step down in 2028, 27, sorry. And that's one of them. Another one would be just that it becomes obvious he can't do the job, that he just his health deteriorates to a point where he or other people just sort of admit that it's impossible. And then the third option, which I think is the least likely, is just that the next 4 years go so badly that the party decides to remove him, to not allow him to continue. And
right.
He
so,
has.
I think possibly there's like something worth discussing briefly is that like I'm hearing from you that this isn't a straightforward autocracy, that my model shouldn't be like it's Russia, that like maybe some listeners will have like a better model of China than this. But I guess at times, like sometimes I'm just like I do just like lump all the autocracies together, and I'm hearing like quite a different vibe. I guess I'm also hearing possibly like that the Communist Party, the party, is quite powerful, and that like as a voting bloc, it like votes. It doesn't get told what to do, but it's not like I mean, it's not like he leads the party, he tells it what to do. That the party has some like pushback.
We start to push at the edge where I'm. The people who taught me this stuff are some of the people who know more about this than anybody else, and they would acknowledge that they just don't understand the process by which Xi Jinping became the chairman of the party and the president of China. Nobody does. People inside of China don't fully understand that. He is, in some sense, elected by bodies in Beijing, but our best understanding is that at the very top of the party there are senior figures, most of whom are in the Politburo, but some of whom have retired, and that they get together in some kind of conclave and they basically work it out who's going to go next. Now, historically, that happened 5 years beforehand, so there would be an appointed successor who would be brought into the standing committee, and it would be very obvious who was going next. But this was true from Deng Xiaoping through to Hu Jintao, and then when Xi replaced him, Xi has kind of upended this system and has. So for example, Hu Jintao just had tremendous limitations because of he would had to work with and against factions within the party, and those factions, some of them were controlled by his predecessor Jiang Zemin, who maintained a lot of power, and so the party in that sense was very powerful and did exercise a certain amount of control over the chairman. But Xi has upended this. He has removed people who are ruthlessly has removed people who are against him. So now for the party to remove him, it would essentially be things got so bad that people who have spent 40 years like inching their way to the top are prepared to throw it all away because it's and possibly throw away like probably not their actual life, but certainly like they and their children's a chance to have a wealthy life, let's say.
Sure, but like doesn't his it shows a certain level of kind of cutthroatness or somethingness.
Yeah.
Like would surprise us if a person like that who hadn't stepped down at the time that everyone steps down. It would surprise us a bit if then he was like, "Oh, you know what? 5 years afterwards, that's me done."
It would surprise us, but again, nobody could point to a speech or to like a private conversation he had with somebody where they were like, that was the information that meant we would be surprised. It would just be, no, there's like this huge vibe, right? Which is fair. Like, he probably isn't going to do it, but again, it's like we just don't know.
Right. As in, if he did do it, he wouldn't tell anyone beforehand.
Well,
Or we wouldn't hear.
We wouldn't hear about it, right? Unless
know,
we did, unless like
Josh and I are very, very tightly tapped into the CCP. So.
But again, like, that's the thing. Like, I could say that, and then next year it might become common knowledge that he was going to stand down in 3 years.
Oh, sure,
time.
yeah, but like, as
you know
in,
what I mean?
it's not. I don't know, sort of like 10% chance he steps down, maybe.
No, because that's 1 in 10 years, and that doesn't quite feel right for something that can only happen every.
I mean, across the. I mean, at the end of.
Right, but
2027.
You see what I mean, though, right? If like. Well, I guess I'm sort of hoping that they would all add up to 50, right? So, I mean, maybe somewhere around 15% for steps down.
Okay. Well, you want them to add up to 25%, right? Because you've said like 75%.
Oh, that's true. Yeah, that doesn't. Yeah, but I think I'm going to get there.
Yeah.
I
mean, so like.
Or maybe I'm not actually. Okay, yeah, I know where I'm going. Yeah.
How poor was he when he grew up? Like.
That is a fun question. He is the son of a prominent family member who's a prominent party member. Who is she? I'm gonna just go for it, and then people can be in the comments. It's totally wrong. I think his father's called Shi Zhongshun. His father was a very senior figure in the party. His father got purged during the Cultural Revolution, and so she went from having an incredibly privileged, powerful upbringing to being sent to the countryside and having to work on a farm for years. And then he got brought back to the city, and he got an honorary degree. Our best guess is that he's actually not particularly like formally educated, and that he probably like there are probably like things about his understanding of the world that would really surprise us from a world leader because of his upbringing. He just missed a lot of education. Like, there are rumors that he just doesn't understand electronics at all. That when he goes to a unveiling of a new space center, like that he like it's really coordinated so that he's like he's shown what button to press and it's marked down, but that he just doesn't really interact with those systems at all on a like intellectual level, for example. So no, he comes from a background which wouldn't totally shock people that he later like rose to the position he's in. He's not a self-made man, let's say. But he is obviously a very competent operator on a number of levels.
Sure. I mean, I guess my mental model here is often like that we should be like my mental model often I think is that he speaks a language I don't know and his face is quite still and he's kind of like a big man. I don't hear that much from him. So like, he's probably very competent. And I think that's like quite a poor model. Like, I don't think that's good. I just like think that like my mind assigns to like stoic foreign men, like some sort of notion of like, oh yeah, he seems pretty on top of things.
Yeah. I think there's a couple of things. So, as far as I know, he doesn't speak English. He certainly doesn't speak English in public. And yeah, he is not a naturally inspiring figure facially, right? But again, like, one of the things he has to do
I don't know. As I'm kind of saying that, I think that like has, for me, like that yeah, I think that just like has. I think that leads me to possibly think he's more competent than he is, somewhat, because I'm like, oh,
yeah. So he didn't get handed the chairmanship and the presidency, right? Like, he managed provinces and cities and so on and so on, and he the reason he got a chance to get to that level is because he demonstrated at all the levels prior competency. However, I think the caveat is always like, now he's there, what information is he receiving about the world? But like, that's really, really hard to to think about.
Sure. I'm just actually like reading through age stuff. Because, I mean, over 10 years, I don't know, I sort of had thought about this, but the actuarial tables, which I don't know if you're really meant to use them like this, but I mean, particularly because he maybe had a bit of a poor upbringing, and my sense is that upbringing affects like longevity kind of a lot.
Yeah.
There's kind of this seems to suggest there's like a 30% chance he just dies of old age between now and then. Maybe a bit. You'd think that was a bit high. Well, but like equally, he may not have had. I don't know how old his parents were, right? But then, yeah. So he may not have had great physical health. I don't know. Do we know anything about his physical health?
Yeah, we can say a couple of things. I think we can say 4 things actually. Number one would be like, I think being a president of China is probably quite good for your sort of like where you end up moving to on an actuarial table, right? As in, he's got access to relatively good healthcare, I'd suggest.
Yeah.
Historically, chairmen have lived a long time after they retired, like push over 90. But there's obviously like, there's something there, right? Also historically,
the Chinese.
Also historically, his like being purged during the Cultural Revolution was very bad for your physical health. So whatever happened to his father is actually probably not particularly relevant here. Yeah. And there have been lots of rumors recently that he's had poor physical health. Like he's missed speeches that he shouldn't have missed, and he has occasionally been absent for little tiny periods of time when he perhaps you would have thought he wouldn't be. We just don't know. But I think people should update to him being a little bit iller than we thought 2 years ago, somewhat.
So I don't think there's like a 20% chance his health deteriorates then before 2027.
No, I think around 10%. Like, okay. Because again, like he's doing one of the most what appears to be one of the most demanding jobs in the world, and like it's only 4 years, and you know, and having yeah.
What about the next 4 years go really badly?
I mean, 5%. I think we're gonna get to 30% rather than 25, aren't we?
Yeah.
It's just not. Yeah. The party and Xi have a huge number of levers to pull to stop things going that badly. Lots of them might like just push the bad away.
I think also you can just leave your 0.75 and sort of say that there's some of this stuff which is a bit correlated.
Oh, perhaps, yeah. Yeah, I mean, I guess like big... yeah, I guess all of those three things.
Yeah. Sorry. I just think, okay, there's like already something interesting to that in that both you're above, but also, I don't know, some part of me was kind of like, I guess he'll sort of be in power forever, but like, that's not the story I'm hearing here either, right? That like, you know.
I think there is I was being a bit flippant when I suggested people think he'll be president when he's 110, but I think a lot of people do think that he will literally go until he dies in office because he can't afford to retire, and I don't think that's true.
Yeah. I mean, do you have any sense?
Sure. So I think
is there any kind of notion about like the honor thing of like, I don't. If Biden died in office, I think people would kind of be like, yeah, it's kind of annoying that he lived that long, but like that he was president so late in life, but if he didn't, it would have been Trump or something that would like, and some people will be like, oh, he should have never done it. And if Putin dies in office, people will kind of be like, well, he was a despot. What else could he do? I don't know. Like, maybe the Chinese people would be like, oh, this was very irresponsible of him. Or maybe they'll be like, oh, yeah, it's only his right. Like, is there any sort of like notion around that?
No, I mean, I haven't had many conversations with Chinese friends about what they thought about him getting a third term. I think that because I would say, just for listeners, I think Nathan knows this. Just for listeners, I tend not to talk about politics with my Chinese friends because, mostly just because if they want to talk about politics, I do, but rather I just value my friendships with them more than I do like this stuff. And it will be very easy to ruin friendships or just to kind of like make people unhappy by kind of continually polling them to find out what people in China think.
Because do you think they'd be scared of upsetting you, or because they'd be testy about talking about it?
I think a lot of the time they just wouldn't want to because these things aren't usually talked about in China. So people, generally speaking, aren't that interested in
I
talking
find
about
like a little bit of a yeah. I think that in itself, right, is like a
them. Hmm.
like we're winding up for the next year of UK politics chat.
Yeah. Right.
Sorry,
It's
US
very different.
politics chat and
It's
UK
very different.
politics chat. Like
Yeah.
I think it's like um uh I remember you telling me a story once about you talking about Theresa May.
Yeah, that's a good story.
Like,
Do you want me to tell it briefly? But,
yeah, it's a good story. It's a great story. Yeah, I would like to tell it.
So my job in China, I worked in a university. I was a teacher at a university, but not a professor. It was called a foreign language specialist. So I was teaching English there. And it must have been a class that somehow, as so many classes naturally sort of drift to, like with the topic turned to cultural difference, or cultural difference was in fact the name of the lecture. And usually in that situation, I will prepare some ideas, but in large part, I will ask students to tell me what they think, because that's interesting and also easier as a teacher. And it was volunteered by one of the groups, and there was just a consensus in the room that this was true. That in the West there are lots of things you can't say. That they're this, like, they meant political correctness. That there are lots of things that you're not supposed to say, and people, largely speaking, don't say them. But they were like, in China, this isn't true. We can, we're just more blunt. We can say what we like. And they were probably thinking of things like, that's like much more normal in China just to tell someone they are fat, for example, and for that not to be meant or taken as offensive. But obviously, when I heard this, my ears pricked up, and I said, really? So there's really nothing in China that you can't say. You can say whatever you want. And I said, yeah, of course, right, And I think you might remember this better than me. I think this was in my last year. I didn't at all. The story I'm about to tell or finish telling, I didn't at all feel unsafe or feel like I was sort of like risking anything significant. But I wouldn't have done this in my first year, let's say. And anyway. So I said, yeah, you really think like you can say whatever you like? Yeah, of course, yeah. So then I said, okay, well, let me just show you why I'm surprised to hear you say that. And so opened. I had my computer open, so I pulled up Bing, because Google not available, and I pulled up a picture of Theresa May, and I was like, "Do you know who this is?" And most of them didn't. I was like, "This is Theresa May. She's the Prime Minister of the UK." Okay, yeah, sure. And they said, "I think she's a bad Prime Minister, and I think she should not be the Prime Minister of my country." And 95% of jaws just hit the floor. And I know this is kind of like, it sounds patronizing, but my students just hadn't considered that was something that was possible to say. Therefore, it couldn't have been something that you weren't supposed to say. Just hadn't considered that this was like some of all the choices you could make about words to use that day. These were not available.
Yeah, I find that because even the things you quote unquote cannot say, I think sort of it's often known. I mean, that's the whole thing about quote unquote political correctness gone mad or whatever. There are things that you can't say. Maybe you can say with close friends, but seemingly that sort of went even beyond that. It's not like maybe these. I mean, I don't know. I don't even know if we want to speculate, but it seems like maybe these people weren't even having these conversations with close friends or something. They just didn't even conceive of this conversation.
Well, I think the vast majority of them weren't. I think that there'll be another question to try and estimate. A minority of them would have been, but it would be much less than 10%. And they wouldn't signal in that room that they were like, "Oh no, I say that." That would have been personal information. There are lots of Chinese people who do have those conversations, but they have them with trusted people out of public earshot.
Okay, so I guess it's also just a thing about the majority.
Yeah.
If we talk about things going very badly
Mm.
in 5 years,
Yeah.
what does that look like? What are some really bad outcomes?
Well, I think the reason I'm sort of happy to give it such a low percentage is that it would be probably another black swan event or a grey rhino. I forget what a grey rhino is.
Well, they're becoming extinct, Josh, so you don't need to worry about it.
Only the northern ones.
For listeners, Josh is very big into zoos,
Yeah.
so that's another. You're learning everything.
Yeah.
Okay, so you don't think a recession, like a big...
No, and this is for people who are, I presume it's the same on Metaculus. People who are active on Manifold, like I have a lot of like mana sitting in orders on that question about will China have a recession by 2050. I'm just waiting for people to kind of pick it up. I think it's at the moment that question is on 50%, and like I would happily buy it down to well below 25. And the only reason I haven't is I think I'm going to get people to buy me at these sort of like better value eventually. So China's not going to have a recession because China will would just spend itself out of a recession at least by 2025. Like the rubber on that road will run out eventually, but not in 2025. So there's an economist who teaches in Beijing, and he's called Michael Pettis, and I know that not everyone loves him, and certainly some Chinese people don't, but one of the things he said, which is quite simple to understand, is that GDP in China is an input, not an output. It's not a measure of economic performance. GDP is something that the Chinese government uses as a way to communicate to the public that the economy is going well, and therefore they simply borrow and spend government money in order to generate GDP to hit whatever target they decide they need to hit. So to say when Chinese GDP is 5%, it's not because the economy is performing at the way that the British economy would be at 5%. It's just that the Chinese government decided they should be reporting 5% growth this year, and that China numbers, can't trust them. Yeah, of course a bit, but it's not like the number's actually -5. Maybe it's 4, not 5. But yeah. If there's a recession by 2025, and I could be wrong, but it will be because there was some catastrophic event, not because like Chinese economy is trending downwards, which it is.
Okay, so you think a recession by 2025? What do you think the odds are of that? Do you think like 10%, 5%?
Something like 10%? Yeah, just like a very low number.
Okay.
And if there was a recession, she would survive it, right? That's the other thing.
Right. Yeah. You don't think a recession is even bad enough to get this this badly? Okay. But like, I don't know. I read stuff from I read a bit of stuff from like Noah Smith. I occasionally see people talking about current account deficits and house building and stuff like. My sense was China was heading in a sort of quite a bad direction. You don't seem to buy that at all.
No, I think it's trending down. So for listeners, I had been outside of China for 3 years. I left in 2019, but last month I went back briefly to
live in Taiwan. FYI.
To live in Taiwan, yeah. And you'll notice the vocabulary I've just chosen. But I went back last month to see friends and to sort out some things that I had anticipated wouldn't need to be sorted out because I would be traveling between Taiwan and China frequently in 2020, which didn't happen for reasons that listeners can predict themselves. And yeah, like it's very obvious walking around the second tier or third tier city that I lived in, Changzhou, like the economy is not doing well. There are lots of shops that are closed. All of my friends talk about the fact the economy is not doing well. Like it's just very obvious to them. most of them still have their jobs, but like they all know people who have lost their jobs, and then they're all under the impression that things are not going well economically. And I think most of them, just again, just for sort of color, most of them believe this is because of zero COVID. That like zero COVID was an immensely costly 2-year policy that ultimately perhaps just went on too long. Yeah.
Now,
sorry. So it's obvious that the Chinese economy is like getting worse, but it was always going to kind of getting worse just means it's growing slower, right? And that was always obvious anyway, because it was growing like at a phenomenally fast rate, and it was growing because of the government investing so much into infrastructure and building in a way that wasn't sustainable, and that's just running out.
And I guess your friends are pretty middle class.
Very much even so, then, yeah.
Even then, is there a sense among some, I don't know, working class people or whatever, like that? I'm not hearing you say, oh, the citizens revolting. They're like super annoyed about everything. They're just kind of like, oh, this is really frustrating. Or...
Yeah, I mean, Chinese people protest all the time. It's not very reported on, and it's like, because there's so many people, like a large protest is like relatively small in the grand scheme of things. And there are lots and lots and lots of people in China who are really poor still. Like they're technically not in poverty anymore, but they kind of almost are.
We mean like 50%, like a...
No, but I think more than maybe like 20 to 30%. We could probably find that figure, but yeah,
400 million people or something.
Yeah. So, so actually, that's quite a good number, because I think somewhere between 300 and 400 million Chinese are currently understood to be sort of unproductively employed, as in like they could move from the countryside to the city and sort of become more productive. Which is one reason that even now the Chinese government is not at all interested in talking about immigration or worrying about like sort of population time bomb, because you've still got this huge like labor reservoir that's not really being fully exploited.
Okay.
Maybe I should try and devil's advocate a bit.
Before you do, I guess like listeners can hear me thinking again. This question I asked at the beginning about the US made me think about. I don't even necessarily know whether I feel like I understand US policy very well. Like, really, I guess I think GDP is like roughly the thing that matters, and so it's like, oh, but like, do I ever really understand US growth policy? Not entirely. Like, I guess maybe like immigration is something I think about. So maybe more than the devil's advocate, what is worth understanding about China? Like, what, I've got like 5 or 10 slots in my head. I've got like a dashboard with 6 prediction marks on it. Well, like, what should those be? Feels like the prediction market of will Xi carry on in 2027 is a useful prediction market to have.
Yeah, I think if people want to understand why so many people have become down on China, then I could sort of sketch out a few of those sort of the big challenges that China faces, which I think justify that sort of general kind of like you have a market called like, will China have a bad year, and like or in 2023 or something, right? So there are.
I experimented for listeners. I experimented with
vibes-based markets.
Vibes-based markets, which were markets with very unclear criteria. For the purpose of, I don't know, just seeing whether what I wanted to see was whether you could just have markets on any tweet. And China is going to have a tough year, and people are about half and half on this. People sometimes get what's the baseline of toughness? Toughness relative to what? Someone said, "Forget it, Nick." After that, just let it. But yeah, okay. Why are people 50-50 on China having a tough year?
So here are some of the things that it's going to be really difficult for China to deal with in the next decades. Number one, population decline, right? Like the birth rate in China is very, very low. It's like East Asia low, similar with Taiwan and Japan and South Korea. So so China's just producing less and less young people at the same time that so people who are retiring in China often have like 7 siblings because Mao told their parents you need to have so many babies, but then they themselves only had 1 child. So it's obviously going to be like a tough crunch, but just after that, people are still mostly just having one child now. And like after the government increased it to 2 and then 3, the just didn't move. It's just kept going down. The difference, this is something I don't understand. The difference is that China didn't get rich before it got old. So whereas places like Taiwan and Japan are able to at least manage this process, the suggestion is that China will find that much more difficult because GDP per capita is much lower. That's kind of like beyond my sort of ability to critically engage with it. Another challenge is the economic situation where like China achieved so much of its growth through an investment-based model where it just built a tremendous amount of very good infrastructure that's very useful. But again, I'm just channeling Michael Pettis now. You can't just keep doing that because you run out of useful bridges to build, and then suddenly you're building a bridge to Alaska and so on. And so in order to keep generating economic growth, you need to switch to a consumption-based.
So is that a real example?
I'm trying to make a joke about Sarah Palin, but I don't know the story. So I think it's called a bridge to nowhere, right? I think there's literally a place in Alaska called Nowhere, and the Alaskan state government tried to build a bridge to it, and when it was quite obvious they didn't really. I think all of that's true. If it's not, then
I'm just checking. I wasn't sure if it was a funny story or
yeah,
just a thing that the Chinese state was trying to do.
No. But that's there are and there are lots of parts of China where the local government is in a huge amount of insane amount of debt because of how much infrastructure it built. But again, it's debt to other Chinese entities that are all sort of state controlled, so it's a sort of different kind of debt, perhaps. Again, we're pushing right at the edge of what I want to reveal that I don't understand. So the idea is that if you want to continue to generate economic growth, you need to switch from investment to consumption. But in order to switch to consumption, you have to transfer a huge amount of wealth to families, to consumers, because previously you've been like keeping wages low and letting the government spend all that money on concrete, and now you want people to buy smartphones. And it is an axiom, and I'd like to hear someone sort of challenge this, but it is an axiom that basically when you give people more money, you give them more political power. And so the Chinese government has been very reluctant to do this, and is still basically trying to find a way to do it to switch to consumption without actually giving people a lot more money and therefore power. That's still an ongoing thing. So basically, basically what happens when countries kind of face this moment when they have to switch from like high investment led growth into sort of like medium consumption led growth is that typically they don't. And that's I think called the middle income trap. And like usually economies kind of founder at this point. So that's another challenge. A third challenge would be that like essentially, even though like the very poorest people have been lifted out of abject poverty, that there are a lot of people who are sort of growing up in like in still difficult conditions, and that they're like maybe not getting great education and they're not getting great nutrition. There's a good book about this that perhaps do you have like some like show notes that we can drop a link into or something?
Yeah, we have show notes.
It's a very important book, which I fully admit I haven't read. I plan to read eventually. It's talking about this like kind of different kind of demographic time bomb where there are sort of so many children growing up in rural China who simply aren't being given a chance to be successful as adults because of the environment around them. It's a lot about nutrition. On top of all of so those are like 3 kind of big picture challenges, and on top of all of this now Xi has added this kind of political challenge of rather than going from like 10 years to 10 years to 10 years, now you have to navigate the end of Xi, and that might be quite difficult. It might be okay, but we don't, again, it's like what we talked about before, it's so difficult to know. But it is I think at the very least, he sort of opened the door to kind of the next guy being even worse, so being just a complete warlord or something, or someone trying to do that and ending up ripping the country apart.
In a way that wouldn't have been the case if he'd found a sort of a mild mannered successor or something, and then that didn't succeed.
Yeah, I think if he had
Or like he's
simply
broken the norms, kind of thing.
exactly right, exactly, yeah. So, not to say that someone else couldn't have done that later, but this sort of it just kind of ticks it up a bit, doesn't it?
Okay. So, I mean, do you think that Chinese citizens in like in 2033 are Chinese citizens notably more powerful?
Gosh. In the way that I've just described about being related to sort of like
Yeah.
purchasing power or something, consumption.
Well, I guess some mix of like,
Mm.
or yeah, I mean like I guess there's well, I guess we can do both. We do political power, we can do purchasing
No,
power.
I suppose I don't really, because I think that I'd be very cautious about straying far from 50% on this at all. But it seems to me that a combination of the party having quite firmly demonstrated not wanting to give too much power to the people, plus the party.
The 50% means it's like really quite possible. Maybe
Yeah, but I think you have
you're
to.
expressing uncertainty, but like you may want to express it around a different point rather than 50%, right? Like as in like you think it's pretty unlikely from the sound of your voice, right? Or not?
No, I would like to sort of like publicly sort of just like be like, I really don't know about this. I think you've pointed out a fair contradiction. If this was a manifold question, I would just put like a 40 and a 60 limit order on it and leave it alone. Which is what
Interesting. Okay, well I mean that does sound like that does sound.
But
Like
I think you're right to say I have just said I think it's unlikely, but I just am very unconfident in that. So,
or a different thing that you maybe seem to think is that like if they do get purchasing power, the sort of base rate is that things kind of go a bit. Then things become quite a lot more controversial because they get more political power, and that really starts to shake things up.
Yeah, that would be hard to imagine it wouldn't shake things up. Not, I don't think that would be a black swan, but yeah, that does seem like it would disrupt. I would like to just so the two reasons I think is one is like the Chinese government basically has sort of shown that he doesn't want to do this, and that seems quite important here. And another one is that the Chinese government has shown that it's like relatively good at managing crises and kind of like moving the economy forward. And so I'm sort of skeptical when people say, "Oh, there's no other way to do it. They have to face this, and they will have to do it." That to me seems a little. People should be more aware that they might just be not know everything about this, and there might be things that they hadn't considered that would be possible.
So, astute readers might notice that I'm looking at wage gaps between GDP per capita and median wages, and maybe this is a thing that the economics community understands deeply. I'm perfectly happy to admit that I don't know lots of things, but I mean, it just seems basically like, wow, interesting. So, the U.S. median wage is like 50K, and the US GDP per capita is like 70K. The UK median wage is like 27K, and UK GDP per capita is like 45K. And then the Chinese median wage is like 3K, or maybe 4K, and the Chinese GDP per capita is like 12K.
So it's like 300%,
a quarter. So it's like a third to like, I don't know, 60% to like 80%.
Yeah,
kind of interesting. So will Chinese? What's the question here? Will the Chinese median wage,
which I think is a good proxy for this question, right?
go over half of Chinese GDP per capita by 2033. Currently, approximately 33%. Interesting.
You may want to edit
So the
that. I think.
area, okay, I mean that's like a take, right? The area
Mhm.
that you're sort of saying there's a problem with like growth and political control.
Yeah,
Like there's like a conflict there.
it becomes a conflict, right? Obviously, it hasn't previously, because at some point, this is the bargain that many authoritarian states make with their people, right? Which is when I was living in China, it was very apparent that it was true and real and understood by people, which is like, we'll let you do this, but you have to give us growth. You have to. I think people often. I was never a China apologist, but I was and am like prepared to say this is like, you have to remember like an old person in China just was like went through a hell of a life, most of them, right? You know, some of them would remember, you know, the war with Japan, then the Chinese Civil War in which 5 million civilians died. Then they probably went through the Great Leap Forward where maybe 20 million people died. Then 10 years of Cultural Revolution where they weren't allowed to go to school, and then suddenly the party said, okay, let's stop all this, and then for 30 or 40 years the economy just grew massively, and a lot of them got really rich and went from being, genuinely. So for example, like in 1990, the average Chinese person was poorer than most Africans. It's kind of startling for people our age who don't remember the 1980s or
Yeah,
90s, but that's, you know
yeah,
so
that is startling.
so 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 even 5 years ago, it was just completely true to say that like people supported the government in spite of what they may or may not know, because of this growth delivery. But
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
but that is like a process that eventually runs out, and I don't think that you don't get to put a lot of that in the bank, funnily enough, right? Like people don't necessarily have a very short. I'm not sure how long you can kind of not deliver that growth and people will be like, yeah, but like you kind of saved up some credit here.
Hmm.
This is
I'll
kind of
come with
like,
a couple of questions.
I'll
In
just say this.
2028,
Sorry,
we'll
can I
you go.
just from like after leaving China the last 3 years, and like maybe you have different conversations with like, your friends when you're outside of the system, but it's just kind of obvious, seemingly obvious to me that my friends who will remain nameless have just become more cynical about the system. That in a way that wasn't true when I was living there. Like they just kind of become less. Some of them dramatically so, the ones who went through really like tough COVID lockdowns or other stuff. But like generally speaking, people are just a bit more like, yeah, I'm not sure this is great anymore.
I'm going to set frame that you think it's unlikely, maybe having 10%, 20%, that China painlessly increases purchasing power of citizens without increasing political representation.
Yeah.
You think it's unlikely that it's going to be just like smooth sailing. They're somehow going to like everybody's going to have like chips to be able to buy things, and everyone's going to be able to like stimulate a market economy, but that no one's going to be asking for more political
Well, more to
representation.
the point, it seems that political scientists just say that's axiomatically true.
Sure.
Yeah.
Well, you can go below 15%. I'm not a political
I'll
economist.
let them do it for me. They can bid
Okay.
it down.
Um, China, Africa. You got any takes?
I don't have any great takes. What the only thing I would really say, I would say a few things about this, I guess, but I think they're all like fairly milk toast. If you look at the actual literature of China's sort of foreign and development aid, people who actually study this stuff don't really believe in the sort of the debt trap that China is like tricking countries into like taking these huge loans and then they're just snapping up assets. Um, I don't really want to like argue the merits of whether that's true with anybody, but I will just say that there are people who have essentially put an academic career into this, and like the consensus within the literature is quite clear that debt traps are not really the narrative that you get from a certain class of political commentator is largely not true.
Do you care to take a stab on whether it is true?
No, I mean I tend to think that that's like they are correct, like as in the
So you
literature is
think
correct. I bow
30%,
to that.
20%?
Yeah, 25%. Like you know,
Okay.
uh, it's always very telling. I think when people are asked to demonstrate something is true, if they always give you the same example, if they always mention a port in Sri Lanka, then you're like, yeah, okay, you know.
Sure. What do you think they are buying? As in, they're just buying goodwill?
Well, no, one of the things they're doing is they're just like finding somewhere else to pour concrete because they've run out of useful bridges to build in China. This again is relatively well understood in the literature, but like not
Right. Okay.
is
They're just
sometimes
they need to employ people.
yeah they have
Like,
this huge industry like to develop like to build infrastructure that a developing country would find useful, and it's no longer productive to deploy that industry in China, so they want to deploy it in other countries around the world. Like I'm sure they genuinely believe that they are doing a good thing, and I'm not particularly convinced that
yeah, I guess
they are
there
wrong.
is a lot of there is a lot of cynicism towards China, and
Yeah.
I think at least some of that is probably misplaced.
Well,
China isn't Russia, right? China isn't uh,
yeah. I mean, it's
China isn't some mix of like the AFD. Like it's not like a country that kind of like went off the rails in an authoritarian direction or something. It's a country that was exceedingly poor and has become really, really a lot wealthier. And I mean, obviously, that is sometimes linked to autocracy, but not.
I'd like to come back to the actual stuff, the Africa stuff then, but let's just like take that point like full on, which is like the average person in China doesn't meet the state as a repressive force all that often. But if you step firmly out of line and try and challenge the system and say this thing that has happened to me is unfair, then probably at first you will be relatively gently pushed back away from that position, but then with increasing sort of mental and physical violence, you'll find out how repressive like a regime that has to sort of that has chosen to control 1.4 billion people can be. But the more important thing to sort of point out is, of course, that if you live in Xinjiang or Tibet or other places, that you don't really have a choice to kind of not engage in political activity that kind of leads you towards meeting the repressive side of things. So things can be very, very bad for people, and sometimes maybe even the word "often" is not helpful here. A lot of people in China have a very, very bad experience with the state and the way that the state is entirely responsible for. Yeah,
Sure.
sure.
Yeah, I think that's a useful correction.
Yeah, it would annoy me very much if people listen to this podcast and went, "Wow, this Josh guy like he really likes China more than I thought he did." I'd be like, "No, no, I just think that people allow their dislike for China to completely color their analysis,
Yeah.
often irredeemably so."
I guess that was more my point that I think sometimes I just oversimplify China.
Which
I think
is
it's like easy to
reasonable,
be
right?
like,
Especially if you're
I
trying to
have
write
like
manifold
6
questions.
colors. No, not really. I think it's not reasonable.
Okay, fair.
I think the aim should be for us to see the world as it is, and it turns out China. I mean, China's like what, like 1/6 of the world's population. Like it's worth developing a new color or a new model.
Yeah,
like,
yeah.
Even if it's just for China, right? Like China's like Europe. like arguably perhaps more important, but it's like at least as important as Europe. So if I'm like, oh well, I have these nuances to describe the difference between France and Germany, then like, I mean, it's pretty bad that I can't name. Well, I don't know that it is bad. Like I can't name more than one state in China, but maybe I can.
Well, there aren't any states in China, so you've fallen at the first hurdle.
But like it's
yeah.
Anyway, there's something.
So back to Africa. I mean, it's sort of a trite. Is that the right word? I think people would do well to consider the fact that African leaders are choosing to accept these deals. Now, maybe in many cases, they may well be, that decision may be impacted by factors beyond what's best for my countrymen and women. But that's certainly not always the case. There are lots of developing countries in and out of Africa that are clearly run in a way that, generally speaking, we would be. So, for example, just to move away from Africa, the most democratic state in Southeast Asia is East Timor. And East Timor has just upgraded its ties with China to a new level, and it's going to engage more with China and presumably take more development aid from China, despite being the strongest democracy in Southeast Asia. That's not because the new president in Timor wants to enrich himself, and it's not because he hates democracy. It's just because he's making a realist choice that he thinks is going to benefit his country, which is going to face some particular challenges in the next decades related to its economy. He's not an idiot, and he's not setting out to to create a situation where he really pisses off Indonesia and Australia by allowing China to kind of take over his ports. But he's taken an actual decision that he believes this is good for his country. And probably he understands his country's position better than most people. And so we should consider very, very carefully that he might be right that these Chinese loans are good for his country. It's kind of a bit, do you know what I mean? I think people should consider that more. They might, they obviously come to your own opinion still, but yeah.
I don't know. I find this stuff very hard to think about. I think much of what we say initially could seem facile. Sorry, everyone. But, find a better podcast. Oh, wait, there basically isn't one. I don't know. I'm not listening to the China Talk podcast. Maybe that's better. But on many of the things I talk about, I don't think there are better podcasts. I think there's this podcast which does it badly, or endless podcasts which do a thing that I think is worse well. That's right. My stall on this podcast is that we're going to do a good thing badly rather than doing a bad thing well. We're not just going to chat. We're going to try and come up with some predictions about the future, but probably it's going to be badly. If we were cleverer and more charismatic and I had a better tool and I had better, then it would be better. But one day it will be, but maybe not today, and that's okay. Is China going to support Russia in Ukraine?
China is supporting Russia in Ukraine.
Like, are they going to support them in like a really significant way? Are they going to be sending them,
So I think I wrote a question.
Are they going to be sending them 50% of their needed munitions?
Yeah, I think the question I wrote about this was, will we see Chinese tanks deployed in Ukraine? Because that would kind of be like a really visual, inescapable, in a way that even artillery ammunition could. Like, some people, I think that the North Korean ammunition that they're have received for a long time is actually Chinese. It's like, yeah, maybe, right?
Interesting. Do you know much about that?
No, I don't know. I don't know if that's true or not. I think
do you know much about the North Korea? I was reading about that yesterday.
No, not much at all, actually. But that was something people were saying last year about North Korean ammunition that had been provided a long time ago. And they basically said they didn't know either, but if you were China and you were trying to do that in a way, this would be one way of doing that. I suppose increasingly, I just think it's very hard to know things about Russia. And that makes it very, very hard to understand things about Russia's invasion of Ukraine. But I still think that things are going quite badly for Russia. And therefore, I kind of think that probably China has already kind of faced a crunch point where it had to really decide, was it going to go to that extent? And I think it has decided not to. 30%.
Yeah, I think that seems roughly the view I hold, is that seems like it was within China's power to, like, it seems like Russia lacks munitions and lacks uh, vehicles,
Hmm.
and it seems like it was within China's power to give these things, and it seems like Russia has money.
But
so,
even if Russia didn't have, if China clearly could decide it was in China's interest to provide those things in a way that Russia didn't have to pay for.
So we remove the money question. They could have just said, "Hey, we're going to give you a lot of military aid here."
Yeah.
And particularly, they could have decided that in the last, maybe not in the last few months, but they could have decided that over winter, right? As like that stalemate was pushing out, they could have halfway through that period decided, "Oh, actually, we're going to give Russia like a ton more munitions and vehicles."
Yeah.
And they haven't. So I guess, like, will China support Russia before like 2025? 10%, 20%.
Yeah, I don't like those questions which are like, will China provide military aid? Because it always feels like you're betting on like something happening at the margin rather than the real meat of the question. But like, so you want to find something that's really chunky, not like, will we find like one rifle that like in an accounting book somewhere?
Yeah, I think that's true. Seems to me that one way to do this is to have polls at the end saying, like, did this thing happen? To try and get like central examples. Because the thing is, you sort of, like, a lot of things you actually do sort of know it when you see it. You're kind of saying, look, hey, I don't want an edge case. I want either the central case, or like there is like somewhere between the edge case and the central case that I don't mind. But like, and maybe you can kind of try and find a way to score that. But like, I think polling feels like it often ought to do that, where you sort of get your community together and you go at the end, like, was Zelensky Time Man of the Year?
Mm-hmm.
We said that we wanted it if I was Time Man of the Year. We thought if it was like the heroes and he was one of 100, that wouldn't count. It was like Zelensky and the spirit of Ukraine. If we'd asked people to vote, probably they would have mainly voted, yeah, that wasn't Zelensky. Was a big thing on Polymarket. This. But people don't love that.
Yeah, I have a question about
but
that.
But it is like a difficult thing otherwise, because it means you just have to like iterate a lot on questions. So yeah, like, I think your question on tanks is probably a bit too much. But like, yeah, really you have to say something like, do China provide more than 20% of the munitions fired by, or like more than 10% of the munitions fired by Russia?
Which might, but that's almost unknowable, or at least it's kind of impossible to think about in a simple way when you just open
so I guess
question.
Then you like have like 5 or 6 different, right?
Yeah.
You're like, do they provide tanks? Do they provide planes? Do they provide munitions? Like, I kind of like, I don't know. I still haven't got like a good feeling, because I really do want to kind of be like, look, trust me, we'll all agree at the end of this.
I guess the thing I wonder about with polls is, what's the difference between a poll and a question that closes 10 minutes before the poll? Or do you just don't do them in that case? You have to like close the questions way earlier.
I mean, I think as long as your voting community is like not horrifically well correlated with the people who like hold the really big shares on the market. So people like,
I'm skeptical.
A number of people have to be willing to take a loss for the truth. It becomes disastrous once you've got like half the money in each half's hands and they just vote 50-50. And Polymarket, again, like the Ukraine example. So for those who don't know, Polymarket did a market on whether Zelensky would be Times Man of the Year. And I might just find it, because I think it's an instructive example. And this is I don't dislike. I like Polymarket, but they are not trustworthy at resolving markets, which is a problem, because it means that anytime you think you're going to make money, you have to factor in the chance that everything is going to go doolally. And in this particular case, I don't know that they're even going to show us the somewhat feels somewhat shifty. I don't think they're even going to show us but the graph is really hilarious. Come on, somebody have the poly market graph. The poly market graph like crosses, like it's like certainly yes, and then it's like certainly no, and then it's like certainly yes again. Like it does like I think 2 flips because the resolution criteria were please note this market reserved yes only if exclusively Zelensky is named as Times Man of the Year. If, for example, the defenders of Kiev or people of Ukraine or any other new group is named as 2020 Times Man of the Year, it will resolve no. Now, as it turned out, the group that it resolved to was President Zelensky and the Spirit of Ukraine. How does that market resolve? The answer was it initially resolved no. Then it got taken to their internal court, which, as far as I can tell, is basically you just like buy your way to a resolution. And then that was I was in the room while it's happening. I think I held a good amount of yes shares, and then I saw that it wasn't going to resolve yes. So then I made quite a lot of money selling them. But then obviously I lost it all because it resolved no. So I got to like sit and watch as a load of people like argue themselves around in circles based on what they thought certain commas meant.
The Spirit of Ukraine, did that mean that meant not some people, it meant like a spirit of the nation kind of thing?
I think so. But yeah. I'm just going to take my time to say if you're somebody who is it's called like the UMA or something, if you're a voter of Polymarket, then no, I don't really respect the decision process that court came to. I saw it happening, and it seemed like a load of people arguing themselves towards the ability for most of them to make money based on what they already held. It did not feel remotely impartial or unrelated to the process. Frankly, the resolution criteria of this question were just bad. So I can empathize, seeing as clearly he was voted as Time Person of the Year. That was unambiguously true. But if that was going to be the case, then you should have done what Taxless did and said whether it was like 5 other specific named individuals, like or concepts could still count as Zelensky. So Zelensky plus the Spirit of Ukraine, 2 concepts, that's fine. But anyway, that's my minor rant about this stuff over. Yeah. Okay. I think we've done a good amount. Let's finish then on Taiwan.
Sure.
Is easy topics. Is China going to invade Taiwan by 2027?
Listeners will note the pause. So what I really want to say here, and I will just take my platform and do it, is that it really irks me that this would be the first question that somebody like yourself would say, let's talk about Taiwan, and they'll be like, will China invade? Because that does a massive disservice to Taiwan as a country that has a lot of internal problems and like issues. Not I don't just mean that. I mean like there are lots of interesting questions we could ask about Taiwan, and I think that I've sort of
sure.
Yeah. However, it is certainly the case that if you go to Manifold and search Taiwan, you will find that basically a good 20 or so people have asked variations of this question. That nobody has voted on the 50 markets I've made about the smaller political questions of like local boroughs and so on. So,
in my defense, I'll say that if I didn't live in Britain, I don't think this podcast would even have an episode about British politics. I just sort of think it doesn't. We're not going to do an episode on Australia, or Japan, but it sort of is noted.
Mm-hmm.
Your criticisms are noted.
Yeah, I guess I think you should do episodes about Japan and about Australia, but it's obviously about guests, not about lots of interesting questions, right? Okay, so again, just kind of like broad brushstrokes arguments to leading to why I'm sort of going to be like probably not. Why don't we pull up what other manifold? They're like tend to hover around 30%, right? And they tend to
So
pull up or any platform you like, and they
I
tend to
mean,
jump
probably I
implausibly.
back Metaculus on this more
Sure.
because so Manifold does have some systems to try and encourage you to do long-term betting, which is basically you get a bit of money back, but it still is a betting platform, and long-term betting is therefore disincentivized.
We're doing 27, right?
think I don't know that there will be.
Well, there must be because 27 is one of the big dates. 27 and 35 are the big
Metaculus
dates.
says 25, 20, 30, and 20
That
and 2035.
that's like fair, but we'll see. Okay, what's the number for 2030?
27%.
Yeah, but again, that 3 years is kind of like quite a long time, isn't it? But yeah, so it seems like numbers usually for 27 on Manifold, you usually see numbers around the. Oh, interesting.
Manifold is 20% for 2027.
I was going to say it will be around 30, so that sort of shows. And then that's maybe
Base rate times. Base rate times have a. No, it doesn't yet. But you know, there is room for a really nice, just like putting these all in one graph.
Mm-hmm. I think that China invading Taiwan would be incredibly, incredibly difficult, and that China probably is very aware of that. And I not to, I'm in danger of using the same metaphor more than or too many times in 1 hour, but I think there's a lot of road left to run, and like parts of that road that Taiwan could kind of speed run to. I don't want to say to force China because I think that takes agency away from Chinese leaders who would be making decisions. But like, there are things that Taiwan could do that would probably make an invasion very likely. Like if Taiwan were to declare formal independence and declare that it was the Republic of Taiwan, like it might genuinely mean that China would like immediately set in like physically begin and invade, like not invade tomorrow, but that they would like take like just essentially obviously begin to preparing to invade. For example, just one example, there are other other things as well. But yeah, it's just obviously a very difficult thing to do. Until very recently, it was the case that it would be impossible because they would lose to America if America tries to involve itself, which I think is very likely. And I think there is currently a high level of uncertainty in private about the success of an invasion. And I have no insight into what Chinese leaders think about that, but I think it would be astonishing if privately they tell themselves, yeah, this will be fine and easy and we can't lose. I think they must be incredibly concerned that they are not ready.
Even for 2027.
Even for 2027, even for 2030, probably even for 2035, because the thing you're trying to do is so phenomenally difficult.
And I mean, yeah. I guess, yeah.
And you'll always be able. There's a DPP, a Taiwanese politician called I can't remember his name, and he said basically like what Taiwan needs to do is just to kind of like always keep itself in a position where Xi Jinping thinks not today, maybe tomorrow. Like as long as he thinks like it'll be like maybe tomorrow is better than today, like that's he doesn't actually mean that's enough. It's obviously not enough at all, but that is always going to be the question, right? Is like, won't we be a little bit more ready next year, or won't things be a little bit better next year, or like. So I think this is not really about predictions. This is about
is about to be sentenced to death. And he goes to the king and he says, "Don't sentence me to death. I can teach a horse to talk." And the king goes, "Okay, you have a year." And he goes back to his fellow cellmates, and he's overjoyed. And they're like, "You can't teach the horse to talk." And he says, "Many things can happen in a year. The king might die. The horse might die. I might die. The horse might talk."
I've not heard that before. That's quite good. But yeah, that's kind of a fair input into the point I'm making, right?
So, I mean, do you have some guesses for me? You think what, 25% and a bit higher
for 27?
Yeah.
No, I think it's. I mean, again, this is a problem with manifold, which is like when it's 20%, like I might be like maybe it's actually close to 10%, but like you're not sure, and like like the return starts to really dip, so you just don't want to do it, right? But like, yeah, I guess I genuinely think it's probably quite a lot lower than 20%.
Yeah. And then for 2035?
So I think at this point, I think 2027 is quite close, right?
Yeah.
Also, it's very obvious there are like quite a lot of senior American figures who've been like 2077 is a significant date that we need to be ready for and we need to watch out for. So that's why that date is in the air, and and obviously that should have some currency, but A, they don't know, they certainly don't know, and B, obviously like there's like they have their own incentives to kind of try to produce change in the world that might be produced by saying things will happen at a certain time. But so when you start to think about 2035, now all of those things we thought about before about China start to become very relevant, right? Like if China just gets much weaker, then in 2045 you might just be like, well, it's all clear, like it's over, like it's not going to happen. But obviously, like if it becomes obvious that is the trajectory, that then there will be this period of like increased danger where it seems like now tomorrow will be worse than today, not better. So now today, and it's perhaps possible that.
I mean, you're 75% to 27, so I mean, the change in leadership can have quite a big shift here, right?
Yeah, but very hard to predict whether a new leader would be so not really actually it'd be very hard to predict that a new leader would be dramatically different from Xi, because basically Chinese leaders want to like in their words reunify Taiwan, and that's probably one reason why Xi might try and stay longer, because he might like to do that before he retires, for example. But nobody wants to be the leader who irredeemably lost Taiwan, and nobody wants to be the leader who says, this was like Deng Xiaoping actually did say this, right? Like it's like we'll not do that. We'll leave that for another generation. We've got other things to do. So nobody. But again, he didn't say we're not ever going to do that. He just said we'll put it off. So I think the idea that a new leader, it would be like a 5% chance that a new leader might be like somehow way less threatening to Taiwan.
Yeah.
And otherwise probably just not much change. That would be like a genuine like, wow, huge surprise.
So you think, 20 to 30% then that they do it by 2035?
No, I don't think so. I still don't.
20%? One in 5? 1 in 6? 1 in 10?
I mean, I suppose I think it's quite difficult. This is one of my like big theses about about Manifold. Like, I always just talk about Manifold because it's the only site I use. I just think people find it very difficult to talk and think about small numbers and to actually feel the difference between 1 in 10 and 1 in
Sure.
5. And I
But you think it's lower than 1 in 5?
yeah, I do.
Or
Yeah.
okay, maybe we could do.
But maybe I think it's obviously higher than it would be in 2027. Probably higher, not obviously higher.
No,
Likely higher.
Obviously higher, but
no, not necessarily, right?
It has to be inclusive of it happening before 2035. Has to be inclusive of it happening before 27.
Yes, yeah, that's true. Okay, but it might be the case that between 28 and 35, it is lower than between now and 27.
Oh yeah, it's just like very low. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, I feel like we may wrap things up, but to listeners, then, what should listeners know about Taiwan? Like, I agree. My model of Taiwan is like sort of small, technically, logically advanced country, makes semiconductors, important for AI.
I think that when I went back to China, I went to my old school and I talked to a bunch of students, a lecture hall of students I hadn't talked to before, and one guy stuck his hand up and was like, "What's the difference between the mainland and China?" And I was like, "What are you doing, man? What do you want from me right now in this room?"
What did you say?
I think actually the reason I bring it up is that probably I will just say a bit more honestly that the same thing I said to him, which is that anyone so about 2/3 of people in Taiwan consider themselves to be solely Taiwanese. They obviously are aware that that the majority of them, the overwhelming majority of them, are quote unquote ethnically Chinese, but they do not identify as Chinese. They consider themselves to be Taiwanese, and that is their identity claim of themselves. And then a further approximately third consider themselves to be both Taiwanese and Chinese. And there is almost nobody in Taiwan now who considers himself to be solely Chinese. And this is a dramatic change over the last 50 years when these numbers were very different and basically have trended towards Taiwanese and away from Chinese. I think people should sort of filter out a lot of. I think you just need to stay away from tankies when you think about Taiwan, because even if you involve yourself or you just kind of engage with that debate about like whether Taiwan is really a part of China or whether like the name, what is the name on the passport and all of these things, I think you basically pollute your mind in a way that would be very obviously wrong if you just came to Taiwan and talked to people and understood that yes, there is like a lot of China stuff still here, but people really do not want to be a part of China. And it's completely ludicrous that we are having this conversation in 2023, 74 years after, like, in any meaningful way, like China, meaning the landmass that today the PRC controls, was meaningfully engaged with Taiwan, even though the name of the state is still ROC, Republic of China. Beyond that, Taiwan is just a normal country. It's just a normal country that has good. It's quite a good democracy. Certainly not perfect.
If I imagine it like a European country, what's different? I guess, does it have low birth rates? Does it have?
Has a very low birth rate. It's like basically 1.
So big education culture.
Yeah, big education culture. Wages are quite low. Like wages are surprisingly low. People work very hard. Like Taiwan has very good healthcare. People pay low taxes. So, Taiwan's
That's pretty good GDP there, right?
Yeah, and there's some surprise. I think so. Like unbelievably to me, Taiwan's I think Taiwan's like GDP per capita just overtook Japan or something, which like I find very hard to actually kind of like. I just have maybe because I haven't spent enough time in Japan. And I know there's like a question about like would it overtake the US or
Wow,
something. People
Japan's
think
is
it will.
like I would have guessed Japan's was higher than the UK.
So that looks like it's quite different from Taiwan. That's like it's yeah. So we're obviously it's a slightly different number then, but it is. But there is maybe it's PPP.
Maybe.
Maybe. Yeah, it's just a normal country that is forced by China to behave internationally as if it is not normal at all because
This GDP per capita PPP is like quite a lot higher.
Yeah, because a lot of things in Taiwan are not everything, but quite a lot of things are quite cheap. Cost of living is a bit lower.
It's better than UK. That's brutal graph for the UK, isn't it?
Yeah,
that's not what you want to see. GDP per capita I know it's in dollars and the dollar to pound exchange rate, but still not pleasant.
Not great for France though either. Huh? So
yeah,
not all bad news.
Yeah, in fact, yeah. But very good for the US.
Yeah.
Okay. Anything else? If I was going to predict things about Taiwan, what anything else I'd miss?
I mean, Taiwan has Taiwan has an election coming in January. Like, it looks very likely that the DPP will win, but there are quite a lot of interesting things that could happen. So, broadly speaking, if I may, like,
you may,
like, Taiwan's politically has like a somewhat sort of like centrist consensus, like where the major parties sort of tend to agree on a lot of things economically and socially. Maybe not like so much socially with gay marriage and stuff, but broadly speaking, the left wing party in Taiwan, like a Taiwanese political lecture would be like, but they're not really left wing. Like they're all kind of like center right economically, and then so that like there are some sort of social issues that divide, but they're not like one of the big issues is just like what to do about China, whether to try to like keep away or whether to just like try and hold them a bit closer and hope that somehow this will because things will get better in the short term, that this will filter into the long term. So at the moment, unbelievably, on the sort of concerned about China side of things, there is one party standing for there's one candidate standing for the DPP who is currently the vice president and who is from the same party as Tsai Ing-wen, who is the president. But then on the other side, which is the sort of, like a bit, don't really like the word pro-China, but it's easy to understand. There are three candidates standing. There are the traditional KMT, the Chinese Nationalist Party, who came from China. Then there is a new party, the TPP, Taiwan People's Party, who are in theory like more centrist, but in reality he is on that side of that spectrum. And then there is a third guy, Terry Guo, who is was or is the CEO of Foxconn, and he's a very successful businessman. So you essentially have a situation where this is not strictly true, but just to make it easy to understand, you have one left-wing candidate versus three right-wing candidates, where approximately 50% of the public is likely to vote left-wing and 50% is likely to vote right-wing. So on the one hand, yeah, obviously William Lai Ting-che, the DPP candidate, is very, very likely to win. But there are lots of interesting things that could happen if the other side, the Blues,
because is it first past the post?
It is.
There we go.
You have to win a simple majority. I think the presidential election is first past the post. The legislative election is more complicated.
So, but because if it was some sort of different system, then maybe it could go the other way around. Like presumably people who vote for the
William Lai is likely to.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. William Lai is probably going to get somewhere around 40 to 45% and win very easily, basically. Yeah.
Okay. Well,
so if you wanted to ask questions about Taiwan, you could look at that and then try and work out how that could change and ask those kind of questions.
Oh
Or
yeah, that's
just
kind of.
ask, like, yeah.
So there's some sort of question here about like. I sort of enjoy that the spread of questions looks a bit like China, but obviously Taiwan should be like to be over here. But then so there's some sort of question about like, will the pro-China Taiwanese parties?
For listeners, like with the blue parties, yeah. If you're interested or you already know and you're like, why isn't he saying this?
Uh,
Yeah.
Align, do a deal.
Well, I was talking about this with my partner yesterday. It's like it's kind of astonishing that the third candidate entered the race quite late, like into a situation where it seemed all he could do was embarrass himself, and like
Yeah,
I think it seems that maybe he thinks that still he could essentially blackmail the established parties into letting him be the sort of consensus candidate because like he's made it even less likely for them to win.
yeah. I mean,
Yeah.
some interesting game theory. I think
Yeah.
we're gonna end soon, but I mean, people might recognize. I don't know. I think RFK Jr. and is like a similar. It's like very surprising to me that RFK Jr. might run as an independent. I don't know, like it. I don't know. I just think, well, maybe not surprised. Just it could do some wild things, and I think it would be bad for the Republicans. It's like a similar thing of just like, oh, I just like add an extra candidate in and see what happens. Um, uh, but yeah,
Nodding.
Josh, it's been a pleasure. I don't know. Do you have any other way people can listen to you? Substacks? Do you have?
No, I mean you can. I do tweet a bit.
Great. Joshua Wilkes.
Yeah, it is Joshua M. Wilkes.
Oh yeah.
And broadly, mostly I
Stands
tweet
for
about.
Martha.
It's so close to standing for Martha.
Also, I realized this halfway through the show, but Josh's manifold profit curve is like, it's just way better than mine. I think, in fairness, a good amount
had a
of
great
American
month.
football. But even in
no, America. No, so if you go to my calibration, I used to be 0.15 and I'm now 0.30, and that's entirely because it's because American football. It's like I said to you last time we talked, is like much more of a random number generator rather than something you can truly understand.
Because you're like, but is all this profit? Is it mostly geopolitics? Because you know how much better this is than mine, right? It's like way better than mine.
Yeah, but I think most of it is just like being on the site every day, and like a lot of it's geopolitics. Yeah.
Oh yeah, because I'm on the site every day. No, I think you're just like, like maybe you should run this podcast. You're just like I mean, your calibration curve is gonna look. What is this?
Sure, yeah.
It's just you're much better calibrated than I am. Well, in these markets, at least.
Well, what I understand is that you also just tend to have like a few markets that you put a lot of effort into, and then you just put a huge amount of mana into. Whereas which is not at all what I do. So I'm very happy to kind of just like be like, yeah, I think this is worth putting a 10 on, and then
Well,
and it's only when I really see blood in the water that I'll start to spend thousands.
Yeah, but that's not to say that I don't know that my strategy is somehow more virtuous than yours.
And well, it's obviously not as good as mine, right?
Yeah, absolutely. But like normally when I see curves like this, there is at least to say like, oh, I'm investing at like much larger scales than this person. But I'm not. Mm-hmm. You have like, yeah. I mean, I have like double. I mean, I'm impressed. Josh is by a reasonable metric, is a better forecaster than I am. Maybe you should do more of it. Josh, it has been a pleasure.
Yeah.
Thanks very much for coming on the show.
Thank you for having me.